What if the most incredible story in human history wasn't about technology, but about people? Not about rockets, but about fear, pride, and a ridiculously bold promise. This is the real story of how we got to the moon. Back in the 1960s, the moon wasn't just a rock in the sky. For America, it was the finish line in a desperate race. The Soviet Union was winning the space race, big time. They launched Sputnik, the first satellite. Then they sent Yuri Gagarin, the first man into orbit. To many Americans, it felt like the future itself was being written in Russian. So, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy went on television and made one of the boldest bets in history. He declared that America would land a man on the moon and bring him home safely before the decade was over. At the time, this was almost insane. Our most powerful computers were weaker than your phone. Rockets had a nasty habit of exploding on the launch pad. But the promise was made, and an entire nation got to work. This wasn't just a few astronauts. The Apollo program employed over 400,000 people, engineers, programmers, machinists, and even seamstresses who stitched the spacesuits by hand, so perfectly that not a single molecule of air could escape. Many of them were just kids, fresh out of college, working on problems no one had ever solved before. And there was tragedy. In 1967, during a routine ground test, a fire broke out inside the Apollo 1 capsule. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed. The entire nation mourned. The program stopped. For a moment, it seemed like Kennedy's promise would die with them. But instead of giving up, they investigated, they redesigned everything, and they pushed forward more determined than ever. Finally, on July 16, 1969, the moment arrived. The Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built by humans, thundered to life in Florida. Inside the tiny capsule at the top were three men: the mission commander, Neil Armstrong, quiet and focused; Buzz Aldrin, a brilliant and intense pilot; and Michael Collins, the man who would fly the command module alone around the moon, often called the loneliest man in history. After a 3-day journey, they reached lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, a fragile-looking craft they called the Eagle, and began their descent. This is where things nearly went disastrously wrong. As they dropped toward the surface, alarms started blaring. The onboard computer, which had less processing power than a calculator, was overloaded. 12:02 alarm. Nobody in mission control even knew what that meant at first. Then, looking out the window, Armstrong realized the autopilot was taking them straight into a crater filled with massive boulders. He took manual control, his heart pounding, scanning the grey alien landscape for a safe place to land. Back in Houston, the tension was unbearable. Fuel was running dangerously low. The flight controller called out the seconds remaining. 60 seconds. 30 seconds. They were cutting it incredibly close. Then, with only about 20 seconds of fuel left, Armstrong's voice crackled through the speakers, calm and steady. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Across the world, people erupted. They cheered, they cried, they hugged strangers. Humanity had reached the moon. Hours later, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder. A grainy black and white camera broadcast his image to 600 million people watching on Earth. He stepped onto the lunar surface and said those immortal words, that one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. He and Aldrin spent about 2.5 hours walking on the moon. They bounced in the low gravity, took iconic photographs, collected rocks, and planted an American flag. And yes, the flag only waved because there was a horizontal rod to hold it out, and it rippled as they planted it. No wind needed. While they worked, Michael Collins orbited above, completely alone, a vital link back to Earth. They returned home heroes, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. But why do some people still doubt this ever happened? The conspiracies started later, fueled by a growing mistrust of the government after events like Watergate. People saw strange shadows in photos or noticed the lack of stars and got suspicious, but the evidence is simply overwhelming. We have hundreds of pounds of moon rocks that are geologically different from any rock on Earth. We have reflectors left on the surface that scientists to this day bounce lasers off of to measure the moon's distance. We have telemetry data, thousands of photos, and testimony from the hundreds of thousands who worked on the project. And it wasn't just one mission. America landed men on the moon 6 separate times. The truth is so much more interesting than any conspiracy. The moon landing wasn't faked. It was earned. It was earned by flawed, brilliant, and stubborn human beings who faced an impossible challenge, failed in public, learned from their mistakes, and ultimately achieved one of the greatest moments in our collective history. They showed us what we are capable of when we dare to aim for the stars. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit that subscribe button for more stories about the moments that define us.